I'll get started. It's 5:30, so my presentation is on working with Che and Che, or one second. Writing and running and debugging Docker applications inside of Eclipse Che. I guess moreover, it's writing, running, debugging Docker applications with Docker applications and some of the challenges in doing that. So I'm James Drummond. I'm the release manager for CodeEnvy, which develops Eclipse Che, among many others. So CodeEnvy, when we develop, one of the things we're striving towards is dog fooding, which means when you're developing an IDE, it's not enough just to design for the end user. When developers actually start to use their own software, it typically will improve the product and bugs will be found sooner. Rationally, creating an IDE, you should be using your IDE as well. A saying comes to mind, practice what you preach, and you make your bed, you lie in it. So I personally use CodeEnvy, which is based on Che, daily to edit documentation for both Eclipse Che and CodeEnvy. I tend to create a lot of bugs in our GitHub repository to improve the product, but moreover to actually improve my life using our product. So I'm going to kind of go through an example of the development process of developing Che within Che and some of the unique circumstances. If anyone's used Che here, that's great, but Che is not only a browser IDE, but it actually generates a workspace that is it's running a Docker container that Linux runs inside of. So when you run applications within a container, it becomes tricky if your application actually spawns other Docker containers. So this was one of the big challenges with trying to use our own product that uses Docker to improve our own product. So I'm going to kind of explain what we did to do that. Okay, so I'm going to go through the steps of the development process. So first we actually clone. It's a Git clone of the Eclipse Che repository from GitHub. We make our code changes. We compile the assembly using Maven. Then we volume mount the Che assembly that we compile into a new Eclipse Che Docker container. We load the Che server web page in a web browser and test, and that web server is running inside a container, a Docker container. Then once we're done testing, we stop it, remove that Che server or Docker container, and we repeat from step 2. And we do the process over and over again. So when you're working with containers, that's one of the great benefits, is that you can spin them up real quickly and remove them just as quickly. All right, so I'm going to kind of get into the specifics of how we use Docker syntax in order to use both our product, which is based off of Docker, and the specific syntax we have to use. So I've highlighted throughout this presentation different aspects that I thought were important to highlight that's different from what you would normally do. So if you've worked with Che before, the big difference is the highlighted portion here. Typically, Eclipse Che, for security, to protect the host environment, we do not mount a Docker daemon from the host inside of Workspaces, because you can actually root the host environment and get access to that, so through a web page browser. So typically we do not do that. However, if you're in a secure environment behind a firewall, or you put some sort of authentication in front of this application, this is pretty safe to do. So this highlight syntax, what it will do is it will actually volume mount any workspace that you start up. It will actually volume mount the host's Docker socket file. In doing so, just with the Docker socket file, you're able to use a Docker client to access the host Docker daemon. To kind of give some background with behind some alternatives like Docker and Docker. The problem with that solution, if anyone knows about it, is you have to give that workspace or container privileged access to be able to do that. So we wanted to find a different way to do that. Also, if we give privileged access, there's still some variables with Docker and Docker that can cause some issues. Okay, so how well you can see it there on the projection. But this is just giving you a sample of after you run Eclipse Che, the output that's generated by our CLI. And once it's all done, what it will do is it will output the actual URL that you should go to see the IDE. And okay, so what I'll try to do is I'll try to go back and forth between the presentation and an actual working with this through our IDE interface. So hopefully it's not too confusing. So first you click on, here, let me show you first the interface. And that is pretty small. Let me see if I can get it bigger. All right. So this is our this is the IDE. This is where it starts out. I created a workspace just to make it a little quicker, but I'm going to go through all the steps. Let me switch back to the presentation. Okay, so you click on Dashboard, create Workspace, then you go through the new forms, and you click on the template. So if anyone's looking at this presentation afterwards, this is a good reference, but I'll go ahead and actually show it live. So do create workspace, create a new workspace from stack, And there's been some changes to our stack. So I actually edited it, and there'll be a PR, and it'll get merged. So we'll eventually use this, but for this demo, I'll be using Eclipse Che Dev. All right, and I'll set this down to 6 because the server's limited. And the project that we want to select is Eclipse Che. So just to give you a run through, if you're not completely familiar, this creates a workspace. The stack defines the workspace. Generally, it's mostly defined by a recipe, which is a Docker file. And that Docker file has certain things loaded into it. In this case, we have Java, Maven, and an Alpine, actually it's Debian, but, and it's got a Docker client preloaded. And then when you select a project, that's actually, it clones a GitHub repository. In this case, it's our actual Eclipse Che repository. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. And I'm going to switch back over to the slides while that loads. All right, so the next thing I'll step through is building Che and Che. So this actual demonstration is how we build a Docker application within our own product. So we're actually building our product with our product. But you can use this template, and we'll get into the run syntax in a little bit, and that's really the magic behind this. But you can use this as a template if you do have a Docker application and you wanted to develop with Che. Okay, so Eclipse Che stack uses a Eclipse Che dev Docker image that includes an environment with all dependencies required to compile and build Eclipse Che. We can easily build our program via predefined commands available in the command dropdowns, which I'll show you. Select Eclipse Che root directory, and I'll go through all these steps. And I think it should be loaded now. Okay. Okay, so what you see here is a project. This project was cloned from our GitHub repository. What you'll see up here, this is the commands that are defined in our stack. So if someone was unfamiliar with Eclipse Che, these commands are predefined, and they just have to click on this and it starts building. The build cycle is pretty long, so that's why I have a separate workspace to kind of skip forward. But what you would do is you would click on the project, root directory, you would hit build command, and you hit play. Now, I won't get into other specifics, but there's ways to reduce your compile time if you working on certain modules of Eclipse Che, but you can select the different modules, and the offline mode is just to make sure that you're not pulling in anything from a Maven repository and everything's local. Okay, so let's say I hit the play button up there and it compiled. What we would have is under assembly main. This is specific for our project, but this is where we have our binaries, our assembly that our Tomcat server uses in our server. So I'll go back to the slide. Okay. So I kind of skipped through the build because it takes a little bit of time. But this is the command that we run. And when I clicked on that certain path, this highlighted portion is what can determine where in that path you are. So if you want to build a certain module, you just click on it, and it's the same play button that you would click. All right. So running a new Docker container within a Docker container can be tricky business. The reason is because with Che, we want to secure the host environment, and if you allow by default a Docker daemon from the host inside your workspaces, you could open up your host to anybody that may have access to the web page. So in this example, we're assuming you're behind a firewall and you're in a secure environment and everything's trustworthy. So we actually do mount, through some configuration, which I shown earlier, the host Docker daemon socket file into all the workspaces that are created. So I kind of explained that there. So volume mounts. Okay, so why it's tricky to develop Docker applications inside a Docker container. Volume mounts use the Docker daemon host file system. So that's important to know because if you compile a program inside a container and then you use a host Docker daemon that's on a different file system, if you try to volume mount something that's local inside that container, it will volume mount on the host file system. So volume mounts are not where the Docker client is. So we have a Docker client inside of our container that can access the host Docker daemon. So the way I accomplish to use Che and Che currently is I actually copy over all the files to a temporary container that will then transfer it to the host file system to a new directory, and then I use that to volume mount. Currently, Che only allows file system mounts, but this also could be modified to transfer those files to a volume container in Docker. Okay. So that transfer from the container to the host, what you'll see in this run script that I do is I have a middleman, which all it does is I add files from my container into this middleman container, and that middleman container then copies everything to the host. It'll make more sense as I go through the slides. All right, so this is the big, long command that I run. It can probably be condensed a little bit if you were to add some of the commands I do to your project. But all these little pieces here that you see will be in the next slides, and I'll explain each little piece of the process. All right, so compiled assembly needs to be in the same folder as our Docker file. A separate folder is created and used for this purpose. And that long command, this piece of it is up here at the top, and I'll keep going through each. So what it shows here is I make a directory. If it exists, that's fine. And it's an assembly. Then the build stage that you saw earlier, I copy the assembly from that folder, and I copy it into this new directory that I created. The Docker client local file system is used to build images. That's another important thing to know about Docker. When you actually build images, it's done from the local file system host. It's not done from the Docker daemon file system host. This allows files to be added to a new Docker image when we build the Docker, when we build the Docker image. So what you'll see here is I've got some scripting which just generates a Docker file. So I'm using the Alpine Docker image. I make a directory inside that Docker container, which is assembly. And then what it does is it copies, and this is the important part, that's why I highlighted it. It copies from the client's, Docker client file system into that Docker image. So that's how I transfer from a container into the Docker daemon. So now my assembly's in this Docker image, and then I build it, and it does that. All right. So that build step, we created a new Docker image, alpine/copy files, to transfer all the files into the container. So what I'll explain here is the next step we do is we actually launch the middleman container, as I phrased it earlier. So what you'll see here is I am volume mounting a, when you run something with Docker and you volume mount, this directory here, the Che dev repo, is actually on the Docker daemon host file system. Not in the container that I built everything from. It's on the Docker daemon. And then the commands afterwards, what I do is I remove anything that might have been in the Che dev repo, because if I run this multiple times, I want to make sure it's the new assembly. And then I copy over the files in the assembly folder, and I copy them into that volume mount. So that's how I transfer from the container I'm working into to the Docker daemon folder. Okay, so once we have the assembly on our Docker daemon host file system, then we can actually launch our Eclipse Che CLI. And specific to Eclipse Che, we use the CLI, and we're going to volume mount that Che dev repo that has our new assembly into the container assembly. And our CLI it detects anytime that there's files inside the assembly, and if there is, it uses that assembly, which in this case is Tomcat assembly WAR file, and it uses that instead of what it has originally. So it replaces it. The one other thing we need to do is, because there's another Che server instance, I need to call the container something else. It's already called Che, so I call this Che and Che, and then I also have to give it a different port number, because they can't both have the same port. Okay, so I know this was a lot of stuff maybe over everyone's head, but let me go ahead and give an example with my last 3 minutes. So we built earlier, so now I'm going to run. And if you look at the Docker PS, originally it has a workspace running, which is what we're working in now, and it also has another container called Che, which is our server here. And after this launches, what you'll see is a new container that started, which is the new Che environment. There you go. So as you can see, that address that I showed earlier, it was 8080, and now this is 8081. So if I was to go to a new web page, guys, there you go. This is the new, and I was doing some experimentation. That's why there's some stuff already in it. But this is our new Eclipse Che server. Hold on one sec. Oh. All right. So it was kind of quick with the run command. I think the more important thing is to understand what's going on behind the scenes. So I'm hoping this presentation isn't just about Che, developing Che. It's more how you can actually take your own Docker application that may require Docker to run other things, and you can use this as a template to create your own. All right, well, that's the end of my presentation. There's also a button to stop it cleanly, but if there's nothing you need to save, once you run it again, it actually will stop the container before it executes again. All right, well, thank you all for coming. Bigger turnout than I thought it was going to be, so thank you guys. You guys have any questions at all, or any questions about the Docker and Docker? I don't know how familiar everyone is with Docker, but that's one of the big challenges we have. It's just allowing other Docker inside of a Docker. So. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you, guys.